Alright guys, talk about the Formula 1 news. Multiple teams making serious noise on the final day of the Barcelona test. Aston Martin's new AMR26 is definitely one of them, but what about Ferrari? Despite Mercedes arguably dominating the last few weekends, doing tons of laps more than anybody else, and putting in lap times that it seems nobody else could match, that story changed today. Ferrari making major progress, it seems, with their car in recent days. Charles Leclerc putting in some very competitive lap times, and all of a sudden, given the fact that arguably this Ferrari is the least developed of many of their rivals with the developments that are to come between now and Melbourne, the Scuderia find themselves in a very promising position. Hamilton and Leclerc believe likewise. Very much enjoy your thoughts in the comments. Hit the like button if you enjoy. Subscribe if you're new as always. I greatly appreciate it. But we just have to start with this piece of machinery, because while there's been a lot of talk about the AMR26 these last couple of days, now you will note as the car rides out to the track for the first time, it's got a blue light on the back, and people are like, what's going on here? Usually it's a red flashing light. The blue, as far as we understand, is to do with the fact that they are running at least their electrical component of the engine at significantly reduced power. Apparently, they have now turned up the combustion side near enough to maximum whack within reason, but they're still limiting deployments just to make sure that everything is okay for the first couple of days. Maybe late this afternoon, they will give it some glory runs. But look, they were on track late. They couldn't get everything quite ready in time. They turned up on the Thursday. They only did a few laps, as we'll discuss in a second. Today has definitely been smoother. They've got some solid running in with that Honda power unit, but they were severely limiting their top speed just to make sure that everything actually worked. There's a lot to talk about, though, aerodynamically on this car. This is the McLaren, which has also gone very quick today, that we'll discuss in the coming minutes. The front suspension has been a key talking point of the last few days. See a bit of flow biz as well, looks like on the rear wing there. But lots of anti-dive once again being employed on these front suspensions. This is a pushrod setup here for McLaren again compared to what they've run for the last couple of years. But that is interesting because the anti-dive helps control the mechanical platform at the front, but does appear to have the trade-off of less feel for the drivers, which is something that Lando's not been especially happy with over the last couple of years. Good look at that front wing, little winglet there. Well, I mean, little winglet is probably underestimating it somewhat. But let's talk about the Aston Martin, because we saw these images were like the only ones when I made yesterday's video. You couldn't see the undercut then because of the shadows. There is this major like cooling outlet on the side of the car, which is different to what anyone else is doing. And the packaging of the rear of this car is, look, it's very Adrian Newey. It's absolutely spectacular in many ways. Now, the first thing to mention, when we're going to talk a lot of things on this car over the coming minutes, this is still a very early spec version. There will be things in here that they are showing us that they will use on the real thing, and there will be some very interesting conversations being had at other teams today because of what Adrian Newey has showed us with his car. But also, that front wing, there's not much going on there, right? The nose cone, there's not much going on there. I think it's quite plausible. There will still be a lot to come from this Aston Martin. So, look, it's worth keeping in mind. This is all about trying to get the reliability sorted, turn up for a couple of days, at least give the opportunity for the power unit to do some running, which it has done to some significant degree today. But also there is a lot of aerodynamic intrigue in this machine, and it looks, I would say, more spectacular than some of the other cars we've seen so far. Of course, no livery on it yet. That will come in the near future. We have some images, and, well, let's just walk through a couple of the key things that have been noted on this car. The one that's catching everyone's attention is at the rear. We'll talk a little bit more about that in a second. But it's worth talking again about the floorboards. Actually, I'll probably go back to the other images slightly better for this one. But you can see this floorboard here that they're running, kind of where the barge boards used to be. The initial expectation and what most teams have done is they have a vertical element before the 3-element upwashing package further back. Now, Mercedes turned up with something very similar to this. I think Red Bull have done the same. So the fact that Aston are doing the same there is interesting. There's also, you can clearly see it really better on this shot, they are also running this slotted diffuser. Now, McLaren I don't think have this, but Ferrari, Mercedes, they do have this slot in the back. Red Bull I think as well. And it's not massively surprising to see that Aston Martin have also figured out that could be a performance differentiator. But the big discussion, apart from just the packaging and also the way the side pods are incredibly aggressively undercutting, is on this rear suspension, what appears to be the wishbone from the the side of the wheels onto the mounting of the rear wing. Now, it's not 100% sure whether this is just like a stabilizing element or whether this actually is part of the wishbone, but exactly whatever they are doing, because there are some rear angles as well, this is different to what any other team is doing. This, I think F1 Dan did some kind of rendering on this. You can see very clearly here the extent of the undercut of that side pod. Also a very clear underbite, which we're going to talk a little bit more about in a second, why that could be important. You've got these like horns as well, they call them, at the top of the airbox. Now, these aren't brand new. Ferrari have used these for years, at least on and off. McLaren, I think, have used these back in the day as well. So, it's something interesting anyway to try and help manage the airflow to the back. But the key talk really has been about what's happening at the rear of the car. Because we discussed this in the last few days, that the reason why the car was delayed is because Newey wanted to wait until the absolute last minute to homologate the suspension. We know that in 2022, he was very important to their suspension design. In fact, he was the key man that designed everything in that regard, as far as we understand, because he knew that would be critical for the ground effect era. That seems to be a similar story again today. It's also worth noting that the wing pylons appear to have been somewhat inverted. So you can see here, compared to an old McLaren from 2009, most teams have these almost the other way around, whereas Aston have them this way, which, again, could change, right? It's very early days, but it does allow them the opportunity to mount the wishbone seemingly onto that pylon, which is quite a remarkable idea, and I'm sure that other teams will be thinking about this. Now, the reason why this is interesting aerodynamically is because this year there is no longer a beam wing. At the back of the car, you typically have the rear wing, and then around about here, where these new elements are, used to be a beam wing that would generate extra downforce. This year, that's not allowed anymore. There's no more beam wing on these cars. But it looks like Newey might have found a way to kind of do that anyway. You actually connect the suspension into this part of the rear wing, and then these wishbones, at least that's how it appears to be, can generate downforce, generate extra aerodynamic performance than would otherwise be possible if you didn't mount them in this way. And this is why when people say, oh, F1, it's not about the drivers or whatever, like it should be a spec series so that you get to find out what driver's best, I don't think you can truly appreciate the beauty of the sport until you see ideas like this, right? Yes, I love the drama and the personalities and the racing and the rivalries as much as anyone, obviously. So we talk about on the channel most of the time. But you can also marvel at the engineering in this sport, and it is a constructors' engineering championship at the end of the day. And ideas like this, it's just what makes the sport so fascinating, in my opinion, because I'm sure that other teams will be debriefing here. You can see, compared to the McLaren, I mean, first of all, the the cooling parts on the side of this car, the outlets of the engine, very, very different across these two cars. And then you can see how the suspension does not work in anywhere near the same way at the rear compared to what Newey has seemingly cooked up here on the Aston. So we've not got the highest quality images ever to analyse here, but some reasonably decent images that are worth looking at. And just some radical differences between the two cars and between, frankly, all the cars. Even the front wings are very, very different comparing the cars at the moment. The other very interesting front wing feature on this Newey Aston Martin is that a la Mercedes, they are running their nose connected to the second element and not the first. Again, a very key talking point of the last few days has been, why have Mercedes connected the front wing here rather than the first one? Because they're limiting their advantage from the active aero, one would think. All the other teams have connected it to the front elements, which would be the obvious choice. But again, Aston, the only team that are doing it the Mercedes way. So yes, absolutely fascinating. Excited to see. It's a really interesting looking car, and that should be no surprise. But there's so many interesting elements there. B-Sport was also mentioning that wishbone, because it moves, because it's part of the suspension, if you design it very cleverly, it might be possible for it to give different aerodynamic benefits when you're on a straight at top speed, when the rear is lower, when the rear is higher under braking, under yaw. There's all sorts of possibilities. But this is what makes the sport so beautiful in many respects. Now, you can see that flashing blue light on the back of the Aston Martin as it comes to a stop. So yesterday, the Aston was spotted pulling over. There was some sort of issue. I don't think it wasn't terminal or anything, but they were just concerned about something. Stroll hadn't done too many laps, and they told him, you know what, we want to pull over here just to make sure that everything's okay. They recover the car. Obviously not an ideal first day, but far from the end of the world. It's not massively unexpected that on the Thursday, the first day they hit the track, they would have a couple of teething issues. Now, Dr. Robs also says something kind of interesting, that for the RB19, Newey was a big believer in the underbite side pod concept. You know, we've seen this on the Red Bull in recent years. Effectively, it's kind of a trade-off between, do you want to energize a bit more of the air underneath to the undercut, or do you want to allow it to flow more over the top, the underbite, the overbite? We've seen debates on that in recent years of regulations. But apparently, according to Dr. Robs, Newey has always been a big fan of the underbite. That's what he wants to do. The Aero team had at Red Bull, when he was focusing more on the RB17, changed their idea on that one. That didn't go down very well. Pierre Wachet and the team were at odds with Newey, who believed it was the wrong move. So, and anyway, we know what's happened over the last couple of years. Newey, possibly as a result of some of these disagreements, ends up finding his way out of the team and into Aston Martin, where he calls all of the shots, as we know. So Alonso was hitting the track today, putting in some laps. The lap times for Aston, certainly less relevant for them for other teams. They were getting quicker and quicker, but they were also running their engine a little bit limited, just trying to get some mileage in. It makes sense. But yeah, I mean, look at the rear of that car. Obviously, the sunlight's on it in a certain way, but that isn't unlike any other thing that we have seen quite so far. So when it's all liveried up, I think it's going to look pretty spectacular. Let's talk about the other teams, though. It's not just about Aston, because Mercedes, they were, and still are, really, the benchmark of this test. They turned up, they did 502 laps over the 3 days of running. It was incredible reliability, durability, but I think what was kind of impressive was that, first of all, on the second day, they were doing a race simulation, which no other team was really close to doing, certainly not at the time. Their lap times got really competitive really quickly. There was a feeling that Mercedes were already doing performance running, doing setup evaluations far ahead of the other teams. So as we said yesterday, what was clear is that Mercedes are ahead of the others in terms of their program. Whether they're ahead of the others in terms of outright pace and speed, that's a question we won't have the answer to until we turn up to Melbourne. There are just so many caveats and variables. It's tough to say, but what we did know is that when Russell's doing a 116.4, Antonelli's doing, 117 lows, or whatever the case was, very impressive lap times compared to what anyone else was doing. Nobody else was below the 118s, apart from the Mercedes guys, and they were miles clear. But today that story has changed, and the story has changed when it comes to some of the reliability figures as well. So, first of all, McLaren, it's not been smooth sailing for them. They had a fuel system issue that took some time to resolve, but have been back on track today and seemingly going pretty well at that. There has been a bit of talk about the Red Bull. Obviously, Hamilton, we saw a spin that he had. Apparently, the Red Bull looks a little bit tricky to drive. But again, it's so difficult to really make an accurate comment on this because it's so early. But obviously, Hadjar's had his crash. Max has been off the track. Max is maybe not having the easiest time of it. We also did see the McLaren following an Audi very closely behind. So it looks like they're trying to get some data on what it looks like in the dirty air, right? How bad is it? These other factors, how does it affect their car specifically? I'm sure that we're going to get some answers on this and, well, some questions asked when we turn up to Bahrain. The teams and the drivers are going to be like, okay, what do we think about the dirty air? Probably before Melbourne, we will have some comment on the extent of the dirty air because let's just say we're not expecting it to be massively improved of last year, if improved at all, to be honest. There should be other ways to overtake, given the electrical differentiation between the cars, but I'm not expecting massively great things from the dirty air side of things. Could Ferrari get in the mix? That now becomes the key question. Again, this is the Ferrari Classic. It's so over. We're so back. It's so over, right? Like, it goes between the two of them. But there is room to be optimistic if you are a Ferrari fan. Hamilton says this year has straight up been a better test than last. He says last year we had a worse start to testing. This year's definitely better, which first of all is impressive because brand new power units, brand new cars, complicated cars, active aerodynamics, all of this stuff. You would have expected last year, final year of the regs, to be pretty smooth sailing, but it wasn't for Ferrari, and it led to a very challenging season. This year, even at what they're technically calling a shakedown, although you've got Mercedes doing race simulations, so it's not really a shakedown, let's be honest, it is a first test. That Hamilton was very encouraged. He says, yesterday he did 85 laps down to the people at the factory, done such a great job to ensure the car is reliable. So Hamilton's pretty happy. They crossed easily over the 800-kilometre mark, and they're very much nearing Mercedes numbers for the weekend as a total. So Leclerc was asked and seemed relatively happy with it. Where do you think you are, right? Where you expected to be? And he says, in terms of the checklist, we're ticking things off. In terms of performance, we have no idea. But today they decided that actually, no, they would start putting in some faster laps and seeing where they measure up to some of the other teams. Okay, that's probably not their goal. Their goal is just to test what they want to test at this point in the season. But it's certainly good and promising, I think, to see teams getting in the mix of where Mercedes were yesterday. Of course, they can't run today, Mercedes, because they've already used their 3 days of the 5. Now, the other thing that's worth keeping in mind when we talk about the Ferrari times is that this is arguably an undeveloped car more so than any other team. McLaren have made it relatively clear this car they're using now is closer to their Melbourne spec than other teams. That is true for Ferrari. It's not going to quite be a B spec, as in an SF26B, but it will be a substantial development. New floor, updated bodywork everywhere. So it's not radically different, but it will be substantially updated by the time they get to Melbourne. This is very much considered a Spec A here for testing reliability. And Ferrari have proved very reliable, which was maybe a surprise to some. In fact, in the morning session today, Ollie Behrman did 106 laps on a Ferrari power unit. Leclerc did 78, Bortoletto did 66, of course, on an Audi. Alonso got 49 in, Bottas in a Cadillac got 33 in. So, not ideal for some of those guys. And look, the Mercedes power unit continues to be very strong. Piastri at 80, Gasly at 78, Verstappen at 69. I'm sure that he might have stopped at that number deliberately, who knows. But look, Leclerc did a solid amount of laps. But the Ferrari engine banging in 200 laps in the morning session, no problem at all. And then we started to see some of the lap times filter through. And this became pretty interesting, right? Because George Russell and then Kimi Antonelli were miles ahead of everyone. 117 zeros, 116 highs, then 116 mids was where Russell ended up. Now, Mercedes bought a ton of soft tyres, so they were intending to do tons of running on the C3, which most tracks is going to be kind of a middle-of-the-road tyre, but here it is the softer one because Barcelona is pretty tough on the tyres. But Russell did a good lap earlier in the weekend on a C1, but it was believed he was on the C3 when he did his really quick lap. Now, Leclerc did a 116.9, again, different conditions, different day, first of all, but he did that on the medium tyre, which actually strikes me as a very impressive lap time in the circumstances, given the fact that, as we say, the Ferrari might not be anywhere near as developed, at least further along the development curve. Not to say Ferrari won't have a very developed car in Melbourne, they absolutely should, but that Ferrari right now are earlier on their curve than other teams because of what they're saving going forwards. Leclerc, it then seems, bolted on a set of softs, we believe this was on the soft tyres anyway, and did a 116.6, so put in a very impressive lap time, and George's 116.4 was done on the softs. That is the understanding that we presently have. So that is pretty solid. And Leclerc says, it was good again. It's been a positive shakedown. We did our program. We got to push a little more. I think that was the question for me, because when Mercedes were putting in those lap times, the theory was, and seemingly a justifiable one, that they were doing so because they were pushing the engine. They were confident in their engine. They were confident in the power unit. They were ramping it up a little bit and putting in some quick lap times, 2 seconds quicker than what anyone else was doing at that point in the weekends. But if that's true, that they were turning up their engine because they were confident in it, Ferrari might be doing a ton of laps on lower engine modes. But presumably to get these type of lap times, they've had to turn it up to an extent. Maybe drop some fuel out of the car, whatever. So many caveats. But it means that at least Ferrari have enough confidence to say, all right, Charles, we can do some performance running here. We will try and understand a bit more about the car. We'll think a little bit more about the setup. We can push a little bit more in certain areas. And they've got the confidence to do that in the same way that they have the confidence, or like the Mercedes had the confidence to do it as well. So at that point in the day, Leclerc was at a 1:16.6, Piastri was at a 1:17.4. These were the other lap times that we saw. Just this afternoon session as it's got underway, Lando Norris has just set the fastest time of the day in that McLaren at a 1:16.5. Of course, great driver around this track historically as well. So close to Russell's time, it might well be beaten by the end of today. But the key takeaway from the day is that this test is not all just about Mercedes. So we'll talk about all the debriefs tomorrow, and I'm sure there's going to be a lot to discuss before they turn up to Bahrain with some serious changes and updates. So thanks for watching, and hopefully enjoy the coverage over the last few days. Hit the like button if you enjoyed, subscribe if you're new, take care, and I'll see you next time.